Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm here today to tell you about a man, about a family man who was injured and whose life was changed forever by a senseless, unjustified act of violence and excessive force by Officer Waldman. Ladies and gentlemen, as citizens of the great city of Chicago, we have expectations. We have reasonable expectations of law enforcement. We have reasonable expectations that these law enforcement officers are there for our protection. They're not there to use their guns without justification. They're not there to use deadly force when it's not justified. These officers are there for our protection. When they use deadly force against an unarmed individual at point-blank range, when they're on the ground, we know we have a problem. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what happened to Mr. Ramirez. Mr. Ramirez did have some drinks. Mr. Ramirez did want to get home. But Mr. Ramirez did not realize these men were police officers. In fact, they never even announced they were police officers until they had already engaged in an altercation. Mr. Ramirez thought these were just some idiot drivers who were preventing him from getting home. And he wanted an explanation. Granted, Mr. Ramirez did not do everything right. Mr. Ramirez, in fact, had some serious issues that night. But one thing Mr. Ramirez did not have was a deadly weapon. One thing Mr. Ramirez did not use was a deadly weapon. And without him threatening or using deadly force against Officer Levy, Officer Waldman, by their own Chicago City Police Department instructions, by their own policies, and by the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, was not justified in using his gun against Mr. Ramirez. Ladies and gentlemen, they're also going to tell you, furthermore, that Mr. Ramirez was using this knife. But ladies and gentlemen, this knife looked exactly like it does now at the time they recovered it from the scene. It was closed. It's a jackknife, and you have to push down a button until you can close it. It doesn't just automatically close. You can't close it like that. You have to push down a button and close it. It was closed when they found it. Ladies and gentlemen, how could Mr. Ramirez have closed a knife? It takes two hands to do it when he had just been shot. He was shot, he immediately passed out, and he woke up at the hospital. How could Mr. Ramirez have closed this knife with two hands while he was passed out and shot? He couldn't have. Ladies and gentlemen, furthermore, the other side is going to say that the hospital records indicate there was a stab wound. Ladies and gentlemen, there was no stab wound. The hospital records say nothing about a stab wound. They said there was a small cut wound in the shoulder. The hospital records never said that that cut wound was fresh. It never said it was from a knife. It never said it was a deep cut wound. In fact, they used a butterfly, which is a type of band-aid / stitch, to heal the wound. And furthermore, there's no evidence that, like I said, that this particular wound was caused that night or that it was caused by a knife. Mr. Levy could have simply scratched himself. He could have ran into something, who knows. But one thing we know for sure is that there's no evidence in the hospital records that it was in fact a knife. So don't be distracted by the fact they're going to use fancy words like stab wound, because that's simply not corroborated by the evidence. Ladies and gentlemen, furthermore, this alleged knife that caused this stab wound had no blood on it. Ladies and gentlemen, it is impossible to stab someone without leaving blood. That's the nature of a skin tear. That's the nature of a skin penetration. You cannot stab someone You cannot penetrate the skin with a knife such as this one without leaving blood. You can't do it. Ladies and gentlemen, furthermore, this particular knife that they said was the one found and the one used had no fingerprints on it. But yet Officer Waldman and Officer Levy both testified that they saw Mr. Ramirez with this knife in his hand. You can't do that without leaving fingerprints. It's impossible. So, ladies and gentlemen, the bottom line is, you can't stab someone without leaving blood. You can't stab someone with your bare hands without leaving fingerprints. And you can't close a jackknife while you're shot and passed out. Now, the other side's also going to say that, well, maybe this wasn't the knife. Ladies and gentlemen, they're changing their story. Because Officer Waldman, Officer Levy, and an independent police officer, Sloan, all said this was the knife recovered from the scene. All three of those officers testified they did not touch this knife until it was bagged for evidence, and this is exactly how they found it. No blood, no fingerprints, and it was closed. Ladies and gentlemen, you can't do that. You can't stab someone with a closed knife. You can't stab someone without blood. You can't stab someone without leaving fingerprints. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what happened here tonight, that night, on December 7th, 1996, was one police officer pulled his gun and used it without justification. He was trigger happy. Ladies and gentlemen, Officer Waldman has a history at multiple different departments of using excessive force. He did it once again, and he thought he'd cover it up this time by planting a knife. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there is no way that this knife, the knife they said Mr. Ramirez had in his hand, the knife they said he used to stab Officer Levy, was the one used, because there's no evidence. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm asking you to simply look at the facts. Look at the facts and make the only conclusion that's possible to make, and that is that Mr. Ramirez did not stab Officer Levy with this knife. It's the only conclusion you can make. Mr. Ramirez's life is changed forever. He was married for 10 years, and his wife has since passed away since the time of this injury. Mr. Ramirez has since lost his job. Mr. Ramirez cannot function athletically or in the workforce like he could before. He's got a son he needs to provide for, and he just can't do it to the same degree because of Officer Waldman's rash, excessive force. Ladies and gentlemen, there are few things that this society and the city of Chicago can really afford to see out of a police department that is anything other than your protection and the highest standard of integrity. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm asking you to hold Police Officer Waldman and the Chicago City Police Department to a higher standard than being able to shoot someone on the ground at point-blank range for no reason. Ladies and gentlemen, you don't kick a man when they're down. I ask you to find for my client, Mr. Ramirez.